Chapter 1. The Life of George Washington, in Words of One Syllable, by Josephine Pollard. The Life of George Washington, in Words of One Syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 1. Boyhood. George Washington was born in the state of Virginia, at a place known as Bridges Creek, on February 22, 1732. His great-grandsire John Washington came from England in the year 1657 and took up lands in that state and was a rich man. George was the son of his grandson Augustine. Augustine's first wife was Jane Butler, who died and left him with 2 boys. His next wife was Mary Ball, and George was her first child. The old homestead in which George was born stood near the banks of the Potomac River and was built with a steep roof that sloped down to low eaves that hung out far from the main wall. There were 4 rooms on the ground floor and some near the roof, and at each end of the house was a great fireplace built of brick, with broad hearthstones such as were in style in those days. A stone is all that marks the birthplace of George Washington. He was not more than 8 years of age when his father went to live on a farm near the Rappahannock River. The house was built much in the same style as the one at Bridges Creek, but it stood on high ground, and here all his boyhood days were spent. As there were no good schools in America at the time, those who had the means sent their sons to England to be taught and trained. Lawrence Washington was sent when he was 15 years of age, and as he was the firstborn, it was thought that he would in time take his father's place as head of the house. The school to which George was sent stood in a field on his father's land, and was taught by a man named Hobby. This gave it the name of the Hobby School. There were but 3 things taught there: how to read, how to write, and how to do sums. And some folks thought that these were all their boys and girls had need to learn. Books were scarce and dear, and as most of the men raised fine crops and kept up a brisk trade, they were well pleased to have their boys learn how to buy and sell and to make out bills. George had been trained by his father, who was a strict and yet a just man, to love the truth and to do right at all times. He was made to feel that it was a sin to tell a lie, and much worse to hide a fault than to own it. George had a small axe, of which he was quite proud and boylike. He cut right and left with it, and thought not of the harm he might do. On the lawn stood a small tree, which his father hoped to see grow up to a good height and bear fine fruit. George made a great gash in this tree with his sharp axe, and when his father saw it, he was quite sad. He called the boy to his side, and in a stern voice said, "Who did this? Who cut this tree?" George hung his head with shame. He knew he had done wrong, and he stood in fear of his father, who he knew would use the rod where there was need of it. It was a chance for the boy to show what kind of stuff he was made of. George raised his face, still red with the blush of shame, and said in his frank way and without a sign of fear, "I did it, Father. I cannot tell a lie." There was no need to use the rod on such a boy as that, and the father must have felt a thrill of joy when he found that the great truths he had taught his son had such a hold on his mind and had struck their roots deep into his heart. It is told that he clasped George to his breast and said with tears in his eyes that it would grieve him less to lose scores and scores of trees than to have his boy tell one lie. But you must not think that George Washington was such a good boy, that he could guide himself and did not need to be kept in check. He was high-strung, as quick as a flash, and felt that he was born to rule, and these traits his mother had to keep down and train so they would not wreck the young boy. For when George was not yet 12 years of age, his father died, and his mother was left with the care of 5 young folks. The task was one for which she was well fit, and as she had rare good sense, a fine mind, a strong will, and a kind heart, she used to read to her boys and girls each day out of some good book, talk with them, and tell them how they could best serve God and man. And George laid up each word in his heart, and sought to pay her back as well as he could for all her kind love and care. She said of George that he was a good boy, and it had been said in her praise that a noble mother must have borne so brave a son. When George was 13, and his half-brother Lawrence 21, England and Spain went to war, and Lawrence went with the troops that were sent to the West Indies. The sight of Lawrence in warlike trim, the sound of drum and fife, and the march of troops through the streets fired the heart of the young lad, and from that time his plays and games, in school and out, took on a warlike turn. There was a boy at school named William Bustle, who took up arms and marched with as much zeal as George Washington. But George was at all times commander-in-chief. He was fond of all the sports that boys love. He could run and jump and climb and toss bars and took part in all those feats that kept him in health and strength. He could pitch quoits with great skill, and the place is shown at Fredericksburg where, when a boy, he flung a stone across the Rappahannock. He was fond of a horse, and there was no steed so wild that George could not mount on his back and tame him. Mrs. Washington had a colt, which she thought so much of that she let it run loose in the field. He was so fierce that no one had dared to get on his back. One day George went out to view the colt with some of his boy friends, and he told them if they would help him put the bit in the colt's mouth, he would mount. The boys drove the colt into a small lot, put the bit in his mouth, and Washington was soon on his back. The beast rushed into the field, but was soon curbed by the strong arms of the boy on his back. Then the colt reared and plunged and tried in all sorts of ways to get rid of the lad, who clung to the colt's bare back as if he had been glued there. Mad with rage, the colt tried once more to throw him, but strained too hard, and fell to the ground and died in a short time. The group of boys were well scared at this sad end of their fun, and scarce knew what to do. When they went back to the house, Mrs. Washington asked the boys if they had seen her fine breed of colts. "The one I am most proud of," she said, "I am told is as large as his sire." Some of the lads hung their heads and knew not what to say, but George spoke up in his frank way and said that the colt was dead. "Dead?" she cried. "And from what cause?" Then George told her just what had been done, and how hard the beast had fought to get free, and how at the last, with one wild fierce plunge, he fell down and died. A flush rose to the mother's cheek, and then she said to her boy, "It is well, but while I grieve at the loss of my fine colt, I feel a pride and joy in my son, who speaks the truth at all times." George was fond of his books, too, and was so wise a lad, and so full of thought, and had so keen a sense of what was just, that his schoolmates came to him when they got into a war of words or of blows, that he might say which side was right and which was wrong, and thus put an end to the fight. This use of his mind made George look at things in a clear light, and gave him that look of true pride which all men of high mind, the real kings of earth, are wont to wear. In due time, George outgrew the hobby school, and was sent to live with his half-brother Augustine at Bridges Creek, where there was a school of a high grade. But George had no taste for Latin or Greek, and liked best to do sums than to draw maps. He wrote with great care, page after page of what he called forms of writing. These were notes of hand, bills of sale, deeds, bonds, and the like, such as one would think a boy of 13 would not care much about. In the same book, it is kept to this day, George wrote out 110 rules which were to guide him in act and speech at home and abroad. Some few of these I will give you, that you may see at how young an age this boy set out to train himself and fit himself for the high place he was to fill. It almost seems as if he must have known the high rank he was to take, but this could not be. His soul was fixed on high things. He had no low tastes, and he was led by the hand of God. Here are some of the rules that George Washington took as the guide of his youth. In the presence of others, sing not to yourself with a humming noise, nor drum with your fingers or feet. Sleep not when others speak. Sit not when others stand. Speak not when you should hold your peace. Walk not when others stop. Turn not your back to others when speaking. Jog not the table or desk on which another reads or writes. Lean not on anyone. Read no letters, books, or papers in company. But when there is a need for doing it, you must ask leave. Come not near the books or writings of anyone so as to read them, unless asked to do so, nor give your opinion of them unasked. Also look not nigh when another is writing a letter. In writing or speaking, give to each person his due title according to his rank and the custom of the place. When a man does all he can, though it succeeds not well, blame not him that he did it. Be slow to believe evil reports of anyone. Be modest in your dress, and seek to suit nature rather than to win admiration. Keep to the fashion of your equals, such as are civil and orderly with respect to times and places. Play not the peacock, looking all about to see if you can be well decked, if your shoes fit well, your stockings sit neatly, and your clothes handsomely. Make friends with those of good character, if you care for your own reputation, for it is better to be alone than in bad company. Speak not of doleful things in time of mirth, nor at the table. Speak not of mournful things as death and wounds, and if others mention them, change, if you can, the discourse. Utter not base and foolish things mongst grave and learned men, nor hard questions or subjects among the ignorant, nor things hard to be believed. Be not forward, but friendly and courteous, the first to salute, hear, and answer, and be not pensive when it is time to converse. Gaze not on the marks or blemishes of others, and ask not how they came. Think before you speak. Pronounce not imperfectly, nor bring out your words too hastily, but orderly and distinctly. Treat with men at fit times about business, and whisper not in the company of others. Be not curious to know the affairs of others, nor go near to those that speak in private. Undertake not to do what you cannot perform, but be careful to keep your promise. Speak not evil of the absent, for it is unjust. Make no show of taking great delight in your food. Feed not with greediness. Cut your bread with a knife. Lean not on the table. Neither find fault with what you eat. When you speak of God, let it be gravely and in reverence. Honor and obey your parents, although they may be poor. Let your amusements be manful, not sinful. Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. It is not known where George found these rules he took so much pains to write out, but it is plain that he set great store by them and made use of them throughout his whole life. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 2. Youth. George was a great pet with his brother Lawrence Washington, who thought it would be a nice thing for him to serve on board one of the king's ships of war. While Lawrence was in the West Indies, he was on good terms with General Wentworth and Admiral Vernon, and he had no doubt they would do their best to get his brother a good place. He spoke to George about it, and the boy was wild with joy. His mother's pride was roused with joy, and at first she did not put a straw in his way, but gave him all the help she could. But as the time drew near, her heart, which had been so strong and brave and full of pride, gave way, and she felt that she could not part with her dear boy. One of her friends wrote to Lawrence that Mrs. Washington had made up her mind not to let George go to sea. She said that some of her friends had told her it was a bad plan. "And I find," said he, "that one word against his going was more weight than 10 for it." So they gave up the scheme, and George was sent back to school. He would, on fine days, go out in the fields and tracts of land around the schoolhouse, and with a line and rod take the size and shape, the length and width, and mark it all down in one of his books. And so much pains did he take that from the first to the last page, not a blot or blur is to be seen. These neat ways formed in his youth were kept up through all his life. And what seems strange is that day books and such books as you will find in great use nowadays were not known at that time. The plan had been thought out by George Washington when a boy of 16, and shows the cast of his mind. Near this time, George was sent to live with his brother Lawrence at his fine place on the Potomac, which he had called Mount Vernon, to show how much he thought of the admiral of that name. Here George had a chance to make friends with those of high rank, and he spent much of his time with George Fairfax, who made his home at Belvoir near Mount Vernon. Lord Fairfax, a man of wealth and worth, was much at Belvoir at the time. He had bought large tracts of land in Virginia, which had not been staked out, or set off into lots. In fact, he did not know their size or shape, but he had heard that men had sought out some of the best spots, and had built homes there, and laid out farms for which they paid no rent, and he thought it quite time to put a stop to such things. In March 1748, George Washington, who had been picked out by Lord Fairfax for this task, went on his first trip with George Fairfax to stake off these wild lands. He wrote down what was done from day to day, and by these notes we learn that he had quite a rough time of it, and yet found much that was to his taste. He and the men with him rode for miles and miles through lands rich in grain, hemp, and tobacco, and through fine groves of trees on the bank of a broad stream. One night, writes George, when they had been hard at work all day, they came to the house where they were to be fed and lodged. The woodmen went to bed with their clothes on, but George took his off, and as he turned in he found his bed was of loose straw, with not a thing on it but the threadbare blanket he was to wrap himself in. The fleas and bugs soon forced George to get up and put on his clothes, and lie as the rest of the men did. And had we not been so tired, he says, I am sure we should not have slept much that night. He made a vow then that he would sleep out of doors near a fire when on such tramps, and run no more such risks. On March 18th, they reached a point on the Potomac which they were told they could not ford. There had been a great rainfall, and the stream had not been so high, by 6 feet, as it was at that time. They made up their minds to stay there for a day or two, went to see the warm springs, and at night camped out in the field. At the end of the 2 days, as the stream was still high, they swam their steeds to the Maryland side. The men crossed in birch bark boats, and rode all the next day in a rainstorm to a place 80 miles from where they had set out that morn. Washington writes that the road was the worst that had ever been trod by man or beast. On March 23rd, they fell in with 1 or 2 of red men, who had been off to war and brought home but one scalp, and they had a chance to see a war dance. The red men cleared a large space and built a fire in the midst of it, round which they all sat. One of the men then made a grand speech in which he told them how they were to dance. When he had done, the one who could dance the best sprang up as if he had just been roused from sleep, and ran and jumped round the ring in a queer kind of way. The rest soon joined him, and did just as he did. By this time the band made itself heard, and I shall have to tell you what a fine band it was. There was a pot half full of water with a piece of deerskin stretched tight on the top, and a gourd with some shot in it, and a piece of horse's tail tied to it to make it look fine. One man shook the gourd, one drummed all the while the rest danced, and I doubt if you would care to hear the noise that was made. Late in the day of March 26th, they came to a place where dwelt a man named Hedge, who was in the pay of King George as justice of the peace. Here they camped, and at the meal that was spread there was not a knife nor a fork to eat with, but such as the guest had brought with them. On the night of the 1st of April, the wind blew and the rain fell. The straw in which they lay took fire, and George was saved by one of the men, who woke him when it was in a blaze. I have not slept for 4 nights in a bed, wrote Washington at this time to one of his young friends at home. But when I have walked a good deal in the day, I lie down on a heap of straw or bearskin by the fire, with man, wife, young ones, dogs, and cats, and he is in luck who gets the place next the fire. For 3 years he kept up this mode of life. But as it was a hard life to lead, he could be out but a few weeks at a time. His pay was a doubloon a day and some 6 pistoles. A doubloon is a gold coin of Spain, worth not quite $16. A pistole is a small gold coin of Spain, worth not quite $4. This rough kind of life, though he did not know it, was to fit him for the toils and ills of war, of which he may have dreamt in those days, as he still kept up his love for warlike things. While at work on the land round the Blue Ridge, he now and then made his way to Greenway Court, where Lord Fairfax dwelt at this time. Here he had a chance to read choice books, for Lord Fairfax had a fine mind, though his tastes were queer. He lived on a knoll in a small house not more than 12 feet square. All around him were huts for his help. Black and white, red men, half-breeds, and woodmen thronged the place, where they were sure they would get a good meal. He had steeds of fine breed, and hounds of keen scent, for he was fond of the chase, and the woods and hills were full of game. Here was a grand chance for George, who had a great taste for field sports, and his rides and walks and talks with Lord Fairfax were a rich treat to the homebred youth. This wise friend lent George good books, which he took with him to the woods and read with great care, and in this way stored his mind with rich thoughts. In Virginia there were some few men who had served in the late war twixt England and Spain, and they put George through such a drill with sword and with gun that he learned to use them both with great skill. A Dutchman named Van Brom was one of these men, and he claimed to know a great deal of the art of war. He it was that took George in hand to teach him the use of the sword and how to fence. When he was 19 years of age, the Redmen and the French had made such inroads on the front that it was thought best to place men on guard to keep back these foes and uphold the laws of the state of Virginia. There was need of someone to take charge of the school of arms at one of the chief outposts where the French sought to get a foothold, and the choice fell on George Washington, who set to work at once to fit himself for the place. His brother's ill health caused this scheme to be dropped for a time, as Lawrence was forced to go to the West Indies for a change of air, and begged George to go with him. George gave up all thought of self, and the two set sail for Barbados, September 28, 1751. At sea he kept a logbook, took notes of the course of the winds, and if the days were fair or foul, and learned all he could of the ways of a ship and how to sail one. They reached Barbados on November 3rd, and were pleased with the place, and all the strange sights that met their gaze. On all sides were fields of corn and sweet cane, and groves of trees rich in leaves and fruit, and all things held out hope for cure for the sick man whose lungs were in a weak state. They had been but 2 weeks in Barbados when George fell ill with smallpox, and this for a time put an end to all their sports. But he had the best of care, and at the end of 3 weeks was so well that he could go out of doors. Lawrence soon tired of this place, and longed for a change of scene. They had to ride out by the first dawn of day, for by the time the sun was half an hour high, it was as hot as at midday. There was no change in the sick man's health, and he made up his mind to go to Bermuda in the spring. He was lonesome without his wife, so it was planned that George should go back home and bring her out to Bermuda. George set sail December 22nd, and reached Virginia at the end of 5 weeks. He must have been glad to step on shore once more, for the cold winds and fierce storms to be met with at sea at that time of year made life on shipboard something of a hardship. Lawrence did not gain in health, and ere his wife could join him, he wrote her that he would start for home to his grave. He reached Mount Vernon in time to die, 'neath his own roof, and with kind friends at his bedside. His death took place on the 26th of July, 1752, when he was but 34 years of age. He had been like a father to George, and their hearts were bound by ties so strong and sweet that it was a great grief for them to part. But George had no time to sit down and mourn his loss. There was work for him to do. New cares were thrust on him by his brother's death that took up all his time and thoughts for some months. And he had to keep up his drills with the men at the School of Arms, for which he was paid by the state. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Life of George Washington, in Words of One Syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in Words of One Syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 3. The First Step to Fame. The time had now come when Washington was to take a fresh start in life and win for himself high rank.
The French, who thought they had just as good a right as the English to take up land in America, pressed their claims, and built forts on the Great Lakes and on the banks of the Ohio River. They made friends of the red men at or near these posts, and made it known that they would fight the English at all points. The red men on the north shore of Lake Ontario were good friends with the French, but those on the south shore were not. They had been well dealt with by the English, and their chief half-king did not like the warlike move that was made by the French. He went to the French post on Lake Erie and spoke thus to the troops there. "You have no right to come here and build towns and take our land from us by fraud and force. We raised a flame in Montreal some time ago, where we asked you to stay and not to come here on our land. I now ask you to go back to that place, for this land is ours. Had you come in a peaceful way like the English, we should have let you trade with us as they do. But we will not let you come and build on our land and take it by force. You and the English are white. We live in a land between you, to which you and they have no right. The great being gave it to us. We have told the English to move off, and they have heard us. And now we tell it to you. We do not fear you, and we mean to keep you both at arm's length." The Frenchman said to Half-King, "You talk like a fool. This land is mine, and I will have it.
Let who will stand up against me?
I have no fear of such as you. I tell you that down the Ohio I will go and build forts on it. If it were blocked up, I have troops enough to break through it, and to tread down all who would try to stop me. My force is as the sand of the sea." This proud speech made Half-King feel as if he had been stabbed to the heart. It was the death blow to his race. But he turned with hope and trust to the English, who thus far had not shown a wish to do what was not just to his tribe. On October 30th, 1753, Washington set out from Williamsburg in Virginia with a small band of men. He was just of age and ranked as Major Washington. He was to go to the French outpost near Lake Erie with a note from Governor Dinwiddie to the head man there to ask for a reply in the name of King George. He was to find out where forts had been built and how large a force of troops had crossed the lakes, and to learn all that he could of those who had dared to set up the flag of France on soil
Which the English claimed as their own.
Washington's route lay through thick woods and swamps where the foot of man had not trod. He had to climb steep and rough hills where wild beasts had their lairs, and to cross streams on frail rafts if they could not swim or ford them. There were but 8 men in the whole band, and the post they were to reach lay 560 miles off, and the whole of the way had to be made on horseback or on foot. They met some of the Indian chiefs at a place called Logstown, and Washington made his first speech to the red men. He told them what he had come for, and asked that some of their braves might go with him as guides and safeguards for the rest of the way. He then gave them what was called a speech belt, wrought with beads, as a sign that they were friends and full of peace and goodwill. The chiefs were mild and full of peace. They said that Washington might have some of their men as guides, but he would have to wait for 2 or 3 days as the young braves had gone out in search of game. This Washington could not do. There was no time to lose, so he set out with but 4 red men as guides, and Half-King was one of them. Through rain and snow, through a long stretch of dark woods that seemed to have no end, through deep streams and swamps where there was no sure foothold for man or beast, the brave band kept on their way. At the end of 35 days from the time they left Williamsburg, they reached a place called Venango, where they saw a house from the top of which a French flag flew, and Washington called a halt. The head man in charge asked him and his friends to sup with him. The wine was passed with a free hand, but Washington did not drink like his French host. He knew he would need to keep a cool head for his work. When the Frenchman had his tongue loosened by the wine, he told a good deal. "We have got the land," he said, "and we mean to keep it. You English may have 2 men to our 1, but you are slow. It takes you a long time to move." The man's tongue wagged on in a free way, and Washington, who kept his wits, wrote down all he said that could be of use to him. The next day it rained hard, and they could not go on. Then for the first time the Frenchmen found that there were red men with the English. Washington had kept them back, for he feared to trust them to the wiles of the French. But now the shrewd man made a great time, and hailed them as dear friends. He was so glad to see them. How could they be so near and not come to see him? He gave them gifts and plied them with strong drink, till Half-King and his braves thought no more of what they had pledged to the English. They were soon in such a state that they did not care to move. It took some time for Washington to get them free from the wiles of the French, and it took 4 days more of snow and rain through mire and swamp to reach the fort for which they had set out. Here Washington met the chief of the fort and made known the cause that had brought him. He gave him the note from Governor Dinwiddie, in which it was asked why the French had come into a state that was owned by Great Britain, and they were bid to go in peace. The French took 2 days in which to think of the course they should take, and in this time Washington set down in his notebook the size and strength of the fort, and all that he could find out. He told his men to use their eyes, and to count the boats in the stream and the guns in the fort. The first chance he had, Washington drew a plan of this fort, and it was sent to England for King George to see. Washington saw that the Half-King and the braves with him had much to say to the French, and he did not trust them. He heard that the English who sought to trade on the Ohio were seized by the French, and that some red men had passed the fort with 2 or 3 white scalps. All this made him wish to get off safe with his small band, and when the French chief gave him a sealed note, he had a shrewd guess as to what was in it. At last, when the start was to be made, the French chief had large stores of food and wine put on their boats, and made a great show of goodwill, but at the same time he tried to keep the red men with him, and told them he would give them guns for gifts the next day. Washington was pressed by the red men to wait that long for them, and the next morning the French had to give the guns. Then they tried to get the red men to drink once more, but Washington pled with them, and at last got them to start. It was hard to steer the boats, as the stream was full of ice, and at times they had to leap out and stand in the wet for an hour at a time, to drag the boats by main force off the shoals. On the part of the trip that had to be made by land, they had a hard time, too. It was cold, the roads were deep in mire, and the steeds were so worn out that it was feared they would fall by the way. Washington gave up his horse to help bear the food and things for use, and he asked his friends to do so too. They all went on foot, and the cold grew worse. There was deep snow that froze as it fell. For 3 days they toiled in a slow way. At last Washington made up his mind to leave the men and steeds in charge of one of his band, and to strike off with his pack on his back and his gun in his hand by a way which, it seemed to him, would take him home by a shortcut. He had the sealed note that he wished to give up as soon as he could. He took but 1 man with him. At night they lit a fire, and camped by it in the woods. At 2 in the morn they were once more on foot. They fell in with a red man who claimed to know Mr. Gist, the man who was with Washington, and called him by his name in his own tongue, and seemed glad to see him. They asked the red man if he would go with them and show them a shortcut to the forks of the Allegheny River. The red man seemed glad to serve them, and took Washington's pack on his own back. Then the 3 set out, and walked at a brisk pace for 8 or 10 miles. By this time Washington's feet were so sore that he could not take a step without pain, and he was well tired out. He thought it best to camp where they were, and the red men begged Washington to let him bear his gun. But the major would not let it go out of his own hands. This made the red men cross, and he urged them to keep on, and said there were redskins in the woods who would scalp them if they lay out all night. He would take them to his own hut where they would be safe. The red men lost faith in their guide, and were soon quite ill at ease. When the red men found that he could not make them go his way, or do as he said, he ceased to wear the face of a friend. At heart he was the foe of all white men. All at once he made a stop, and then turned and fired on them. Washington found that he was not hit, so he turned to Mr. Gist and said, "Are you shot?" "No," said Gist. Then the red men ran to a big white oak to load his gun. Gist would have killed him, but Washington would not let him. Gist says, "We let him charge his gun. We found he put in a ball. Then we took care of him. The major or I stood by the guns. We made him make a fire for us by a small run, as if we were meant to sleep there. I said to the major, 'As you will not have him killed, we must get rid of him in some way, and then we must march on all night.' On which I said to the red men, 'I suppose you were lost and fired your gun.' He said he knew the way to his log hut, and it was not far off. 'Well,' said I, 'do you go home?' and as we are tired we will follow your track in the morning. And here is a cake of bread for you, and you must give us meat in the morning." He was glad to get off. Washington says, "We walked all the rest of the night, and made no stop that we might get to the start so far as to be out of their reach the next day, since we were quite sure they would get on our track as soon as it was light. But no more was seen or heard of them. And the next night at dusk the two white men came to the Allegheny, which they thought to cross on the ice. This they could not do, so they had to go to work with but one small axe, and a poor one at that, and make a raft. It was a whole day's work. They next got it launched, and went on board of it, then set off. But when they were in midstream the raft was jammed in the ice in such a way that death seemed to stare them in the face. Washington put out his pole to stay the raft so that the ice might pass by. But the tide was so swift that it drove the ice with great force. It bore down on the pole so hard that Washington was thrown into the stream, where it was at least 10 feet deep. He would have been swept out of sight if he had not caught hold of one of the raft logs. As they found they could not cross the stream or get back to the shore they had left, they quit the raft and got on a small isle near which they were borne by the tide. But this was not the end of their ill luck. It was so cold that Mr. Gist's hands and feet froze, and both he and Washington were in great pain throughout the long dark night. A gleam of hope came with the dawn of day, for they found the ice twixt them and the east bank of the stream was so hard as to bear their weight, and they made their way on it, and the same day came to a place where they could rest. Here they spent 2 or 3 days. They set out on the 1st of January, and the next day came to the Monongahela, where Washington bought a horse. On the 11th he got to Belvoir, where he stopped one day to take the rest he was in need of, and then set out and reached Williamsburg on the 16th of January. He gave to Governor Dinwiddie the note that he had brought from the French chief, showed him the plans of the fort, and told him all that he had seen and done, the fame of his deeds, of the ills he had borne, and the nerve and pluck he had shown, was soon noised abroad, and George Washington, though a mere youth, was looked up to by young and old.
End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
Chapter 4. To the Front. The French chief in his note to Governor Dinwiddie had said, in words that were smooth but clear, that he would not leave the banks of the Ohio, so the English felt as if it were time for them to make a move, though they did not wish to bring on a war. Land was set off on the Ohio, where a fort was built, and the rest of it left for the use of the troops. Washington was asked to lead the troops, but he shrank from it, as a charge too great for one so young. So Joshua Fry was made colonel, and Washington lieutenant colonel of a force of 300 men. It was hard to get men to join the ranks. The pay was small, and those who had good farms and good homes did not care to leave them. Those who had a mind to go were for the most part men who did not like to work, and had no house or home that they could call their own. Some were barefoot. Some had no shirts to their backs, and not a few were without coat or waistcoat, as the vest was called in those days. If it was hard work to get these kind of men, it was still more of a task to find those who would serve as chiefs. And Washington found himself left in charge of a lot of raw troops who knew no will but their own. But Van Braam, who had taught Washington how to use the sword, was with him, and gave him just the aid he had need of at this time. On April 2nd, 1754, Washington, at the head of 150 men, set off for the new fort at the fork of the Ohio. The roads were rough, and the march was slow, and it was not till April 20th that they reached Will's Creek. Here they were met by a small force, in charge of Captain Adam Stephen. The rest of the force, with the field guns, were to come by way of the Potomac. These last were in charge of Colonel Fry. When Washington reached Will's Creek, word was brought him that a large force of French troops had borne down on the new fort. Captain Trent, who was in charge of the few troops in the fort, was away at the time, and the young Ensign Ward did not know what to do. He sought the aid of Half King, who told him to plead with the French and to beg them to wait till the captain came back, and the two went at once to the French camp. But the French would not wait or make terms of peace. They had come as foes, and told Ensign Ward that if he did not leave the fort at once with all his men, they would put him out by force. All the French would grant was that our men might take their tools with them. So the next morn they filed out of the fort, gave up their arms, and took the path to the woods. The French took the fort and built it up, and called it Fort Duquesne, which was the name of the governor of Canada. When the sad news was brought to Washington, he was at a loss to know what to do, or which way to turn. Here he was with a small band of raw troops right in the midst of foes, red and white, who would soon hem them in and use them ill if they found out where they were. Yet it would not do to turn back or show signs of fear. Colonel Fry had not yet come up, and the weight of care was thrown on Washington. He let the governors of Pennsylvania and Maryland know of his plight, and urged them to send on troops, but none came to his aid. He had a talk with his chief men, and they all thought it would be best to push on through the wild lands and make the road as they went on, and try to reach the mouth of Redstone Creek, where they would build a fort. By this means the men would be kept at work, their fears would be quelled, and a way made for the smooth and swift march of the troops in the rear. There was so much to be done that the men, work as hard as they might, could not clear the way with much speed. There were great trees to be cut down, rocks to be moved, swamps to be filled up, and streams to be bridged. While in the midst of these toils, the bread gave out, and the lack of food made the men too weak to work. In spite of all these ills, they made out to move at a rate of 4 miles a day up steep hills and through dense woods that have since borne the name of the Shades of Death. While at a large stream where they had to stop to build a bridge, Washington was told that it was not worthwhile for him to try to go by land to Redstone Creek, when he could go by boat in much less time. This would be a good plan if it would work, and to make sure, Washington took 5 men with him in a bark boat down the stream. One of these men was a redskin guide. When they had gone 10 miles, the guide said that was as far as he would go. Washington said, "Why do you want to leave us now? We need you, and you know that we cannot get on without you. Tell us why you wish to leave." The red men said, "Me want gifts. The red men will not work without them. The French know this and are wise. If you want the red men to be your guides, you must buy them. They do not love you so well that they will serve you without pay." Washington told the guide that when they got back, he would give them a fine white shirt with a frill on it and a good greatcoat, and this put an end to the strike for that time. They kept on in a small boat for a score of miles, till they came to a place where there was a falls in the stream at least 40 feet. This put a stop to their course, and Washington went back to camp with his mind made up to go on by land. He was on his way to join his troops when word was brought him from Half King to be on his guard, as the French were close at hand. They had been on the march for 2 days, and meant to strike the first foe they should see. Half King said that he and the rest of his chiefs would be with Washington in 5 days to have a talk. Washington set to work at once to get his troops in shape to meet the foe. Scouts were sent out. There was a scare in the night. The troops sprang to arms and kept on the march till daybreak. In the meantime, at 9 o'clock at night, word came from Half King, who was then 6 miles from the camp, that he had seen the tracks of 2 Frenchmen, and the whole force was near that place. Washington put himself at the head of 20 men, left the rest to guard the camp, and set off to join Half King. The men had to grope their way by footpaths through the woods. The night was dark, and there had been quite a fall of rain, so that they slipped and fell and lost their way, and had to climb the great rocks and the trees that had been blown down and blocked their way. It was near sunrise when they came up to the camp of Half King, who at once set out with a few of his braves to show Washington the tracks he had seen. Then Half King called up 2 of his braves, showed them the tracks, and told them what to do. They took the scent and went off like hounds, and brought back word that they had traced the footprints to a place shut in by rocks and trees where the French were in camp. It was planned to take them off their guard. Washington was to move on the right, Half King and his men on the left. They made not a sound. Washington was the first on the ground, and as he came out from the rocks and trees at the head of his men, the French caught sight of him and ran to their arms. A sharp fire was kept up on both sides. De Jumonville, who led the French troops, was killed with 10 of his men. One of Washington's men was killed, and 2 or 3 met with wounds. None of the red men were hurt, as the French did not aim their guns at them at all. In less than half an hour the French gave way and ran, but Washington's men soon came up with them, took them, and they were sent in charge of a strong guard to Governor Dinwiddie. This was the first act of war in which blood had been shed, and Washington had to bear a great deal of blame from both French and England till the truth was made known. He was thought to have been too rash and too bold, and in more haste to make war than to seek for peace. These sins were charged to his youth, for it was not known then how much more calm and wise and shrewd he was than most men who were twice his age. The French claimed that this band had been sent out to ask Washington in a kind way to leave the lands that were held by the crown of France, but Washington was sure they were spies. And Half King said they had bad hearts, and if our men were such fools as to let them go, he would give them no more aid. Half King was full of fight, and Washington was flushed with pride, and in haste to move on and brave the worst. He rode home. The Mingos have struck the French, and I hope will give a good blow before they have done. Then he told of the fight he had been in, and how he had won it, and was not hurt though he stood in the midst of the fierce fire. The balls whizzed by him, and, said Washington, I was charmed with the sound. This boast came to the ears of George II, who said, in a dry sort of way, he would not say so if he had heard many. When long years had passed, someone asked Washington if he had made such a speech. If I did, he said, it was when I was young, and he was but 22 years of age. He knew that as soon as the French heard of the fight and their bad luck, they would send a strong force out to meet him. So he set all his men to work to add to the size of the earthwork, and to fence it in so that it might be more of a stronghold. Then he gave to it the name of Fort Necessity, for it had been thrown up in great haste in time of great need, when food was so scant it was feared the troops would starve to death. At one time, for 6 days, they had no flour and, of course, no bread. News came of the death of Colonel Fry at Will's Creek, and Washington was forced to take charge of the whole force. Fry's troop, 300 in all, came up from Will's Creek, and Half King brought 40 red men with their wives and young ones, and all these had to be fed and cared for. Young as he was, Washington was like a father to this strange group of men. On Sundays, when in camp, he read to them from the Word of God, and by all his acts made them feel that he was a good and true man and fit to be their chief. The red men did quite well as spies and scouts, but were not of much use in the field, and they, and some men from South Carolina, did much to vex young Washington. Half King did not like the way that white men fought, so he took himself and his band off to a safe place. The white men from South Carolina, who had come out to serve their king, were too proud to soil their hands or do hard work, nor would they be led by a man of the rank of colonel. In the midst of all these straits, Washington stood calm and firm. The South Carolina troops were left to guard the fort, while the rest of the men set out to clear the road to Redstone Creek. Their march was slow and full of toil, and at the end of 2 weeks they had gone but 13 miles. Here at Gist's home, where they stopped to rest, word came to Washington that a large force of the French were to be sent out to fight him. Word was sent to the fort to have the men that were there to join them with all speed. They reached Gist's at dusk, and by dawn of the next day all our troops were in that place, where it was at first thought they would wait for the foe. But this plan they gave up, for it was deemed best to make haste back to the fort, where they might at least screen themselves from the fire of the foe. The roads were rough, the heat was great, the food was scant, and the men weak and worn out. There were but few steeds, and these had to bear such great loads that they could not move with speed. Washington gave up his own horse and went on foot, and the rest of the headmen did the same. The troops from Virginia worked with a will and would take turns and haul the big field guns, while the King's troops from South Carolina walked at their ease and would not lend a hand or do a stroke of work. On the morn of July 3rd, scouts brought word to the fort that the French were but 4 miles off and in great force. Washington at once drew up his men on the ground outside of the fort to wait for the foe. Ere noon the French were quite near the fort, and the sound of their guns was heard. Washington thought this was a trick to draw his men out into the woods, so he told them to hold their fire till the foe came in sight. But as the French did not show themselves, though they still kept up their fire, he drew his troops back to the fort and bade them fire at will and do their best to hit their mark. The rain fell all day long, so that the men in the fort were half drowned, and some of the guns scarce fit for use. The fire was kept up till 8 o'clock at night, when the French sent word they would like to make terms with our men. Washington thought it was a trick to find out the state of things in the fort, and for a time gave no heed to the call. The French sent 2 or 3 times, and at last brought the terms for Washington to read. They were in French. There was nothing at hand to write with, so Van Braam, who could speak French, was called on to give the key. It was a queer scene. A light was brought and held close to his face so that he could see to read. The rain fell in such sheets that it was hard to work to keep up the flame. Van Braam mixed up Dutch, French, and English in a sad way, while Washington and his chief aides stood near with heads bent and tried their best to guess what was meant. They made out at last that the main terms were that the troops might march out of the fort and fear no harm from French or Redskins as they made their way back to their homes. The drums might beat and the flags fly, and they could take with them all the goods and stores and all that was in the fort but the large guns. These the French would break up, and our men should pledge themselves not to build on the lands which were claimed by the King of France for the space of 1 year. The weak had to yield to the strong, and Washington and his men laid down their arms and marched out of the fort. A note of thanks was sent to Washington and all his head men but Van Braam, who was thought to have read the terms in such a way as to harm our side and serve the French. But there were those who felt that Van Braam was as true as he was brave, and that it was the fault of his head and not his heart, for it was a hard task for a Dutchman to turn French into English and make sense of it.
End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 5. As aide-de-camp. In spite of the way in which the fight at Great Meadows came to an end, Governor Dinwiddie made up his mind that the troops, led by Washington, should cross the hills and drive the French from Fort Duquesne. Washington thought it a wild scheme, for the snow lay deep on the hills. His men were worn out and had no arms, nor tents, nor clothes, nor food, such as would fit them to take the field. It would need gold to buy these things, as well as to pay for fresh troops. Gold was placed in the governor's hands to use as he pleased. Our force was spread out into 10 bands of 100 men each. The king's troops were put in high rank, and Colonel Washington was made captain. This, of course, was more than he could bear, so he left the army at once, and with a sad heart. In a short time, Governor Sharp of Maryland was placed by King George at the head of all the force that was to fight the French. He knew that he would need the aid of Washington, and he begged him to come back and serve with him in the field. But Washington did not like the terms and paid no heed to the call. The next spring, General Braddock came from England with 2 large bands of well-trained troops, which it was thought would drive the French back into Canada. Our men were full of joy and thought the war would soon be at an end. Braddock urged Washington to join him in the field. Washington felt that he could be of great use, as he knew the land and the ways of red men. So he took up the sword once more as Braddock's aide-de-camp. Benjamin Franklin, who had charge of the mails, lent his aid to the cause, and did all that he could to serve Braddock and his men. Braddock, with his staff and guard of horsemen, set out for Will's Creek by the way of Winchester in April 1755. He rode in a fine turnout that he had bought of Governor Sharp, which he soon found out was not meant for use on rough roads. But he had fought with dukes and men of high rank, and was fond of show, and liked to put on a great deal of style. He thought that this would make the troops look up to him, and would add much to his fame. In May, the troops went into camp, and Washington had a chance to learn much of the art of war that was new and strange to him, and to see some things that made him smile.
All the rules and forms of camp life were kept up. One of the headmen who died while in camp was borne to the grave in this style. A guard marched in front of the corpse, the captain of it in the rear. Each man held his gun upside down as a sign that the dead would war no more, and the drums beat the dead march. When near the grave, the guard formed 2 lines that stood face to face, let their guns rest on the ground, and leaned their heads on the butts. The corpse was borne twixt these 2 rows of men with the sword and sash on the top of the box in which he lay, and in the rear of it the men of rank marched 2 and 2. When the corpse was put in the ground, the guard fired their guns 3 times, and then all the troops marched back to camp. The red men, the Delawares and the Shawnees, came to aid General Braddock. With them were White Thunder, who had charge of the speech belts, and Silver Heels, who was swift of foot. Half King was dead, and White Thunder reigned in his stead. The red men had a camp to themselves, where they would sing and dance and howl and yell for half the night. It was fun for the king's troops to watch them at their sports and games, and they soon found a great charm in the wild sort of life. In the daytime, the red men and their squaws, rigged up in their plumes and war paint, hung round Braddock's camp and gazed spellbound at the troops as they went through their drills. But this state of things did not last long, and strife rose twixt the red and white men, and some of the redskins left the camp. They told Braddock they would meet him on his march, but they did not keep their word. Washington was sent to Williamsburg to bring the gold of which there was need, and when he came back he found that Braddock had left a small guard at Fort Cumberland on Will's Creek and was then on his way to Fort Duquesne. He would give no heed to those who knew more of the backwoods than he did, nor call on the red men to serve as scouts and guides. He was not used to that kind of warfare and scorned to be taught by such a youth as George Washington. The march was a hard one for man and beast. Up steep hills and through rough roads they had to drag the guns, and Braddock soon found out that these new fields were not like the ones on which he had been wont to fight. Hard as it was for his pride to seek the aid of so young a man, he was at last forced to ask Washington to help him out of these straits. They had then made a halt at Little Meadows. Washington said there was no time to lose. They must push on at once. While at this place, Captain Jack and his brave band of huntsmen came into camp. They were fond of the chase and were well armed with knives and guns and looked quite like a tribe of redskins as they came out of the wood. Braddock met them in a stiff sort of way. Captain Jack stepped in front of his band and said that he and his men were used to rough work and knew how to deal with the red men and would be glad to join the force.